The fans bought half the tickets by post, and then 5,000 queued, some of them for 2 nights, in hope of obtaining the rest. Here are some of the lucky 2,500 who really are going to see the Beatles at the ABC Ardwick, Manchester. The manager makes sure that every member of his staff is ready for the biggest night of the year, able to cope with a terrific audience response evoked everywhere by the Beatles. Paul McCartney gets the full treatment, the kind the fans have taught him to expect. The boys show the press their latest present. They're a natural, these fabulous four, bubbling over with fun, getting as much kick out of entertaining as the fans get from them. Ringo, a fab drummer and always good for a laugh. We're going to have the privilege of filming a small part of the Beatles show as given on the stage of this theatre. It'll be a sample of what millions have heard and seen all over the country. When they come to your town, well, you won't need any further invitation. You'll be there. We show this film by generous permission of their famous manager, Brian Epstein. George Harrison, Ringo Starr. John Lennon, Paul McCartney. Only a few seconds more and the doors will open.
Well, she loves you. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. She loves you, yeah, 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 yeah. Lost your love. Well, I saw her yesterday. She's thinking of, and she told me what to say. She said she loves you, and you know that can be bad. And you know you should be glad. She said you she almost lost her mind. Now she says she knows you're not the hurting kind. She said she loves you, and you know that can be bad. She loves you, and you know you should be glad. It's only fair, I can hurt you too. Apologize to her, because she loves you, and you know that can't be bad. She loves you, and you know you should be glad. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. With a love like that, you know you should be glad. With a love like that, you know you should be glad. You know you should be glad. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah. Glass onion. John Lennon.
Hello everybody, welcome to episode 94 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. Hot on the heels of episode 93 for a change. I'm trying to keep up a monthly schedule, so I was thinking I want to get 12 episodes out this year, and I missed 1 month. I think it was February, when I was in the depths of winter melancholy, so I'm trying to make up for that. As you'll hear at the end, I've got everything recorded to the end of 2023, so that's a bit of a weight off my mind. The clip you just heard was a Pathé News report, always worth it just to hear that guy's voice. The report was called The Beatles Come to Town, about an appearance by the lads, as you heard, at the ABC Ardwick Cinema in Manchester, which is just down the M62 from Liverpool. Although, as you heard in part one with Ken, there wasn't an M62 in those days, only a couple of motorways. That appearance was in late November 1963 and was in fact just 2 days, I believe, before a certain world-shaking and gruesome event in Dallas, Texas that will be mentioned in this part of my talk with Ken McNab. We don't cover this particular concert, but I would urge you to watch the film of this news report, which is in the show notes. It seems to repeat itself, but there's about, 6-7 minutes of original footage. It's so evocative with music and images that really just sum up 1963 perfectly. Certainly the second half of 1963, when Beatlemania really started to bite. Must have been exhilarating, but also quite frightening as well, seeing the frenzy in the audience's eyes. We don't really go into the dark side of Beatlemania here, but that has been well covered elsewhere. And of course, there's none of that in the Pathé clips. It's all very jolly. And the Beatles come to Manchester. It's all that kind of reporting, which was basically all the reporting in those days. Have a look on the floor of the stage as well when you watch that clip, and you might see a few jelly babies there. And by the way, in America, they are jelly beans, and they're much heavier. So when this news that the Beatles like jelly babies circulated from England, this is what I've heard anyway, in America they started to throw jelly beans at them, and I think they can be quite lethal if they're thrown in sufficient numbers, but I guess that's a 1964 story. 1963 is jelly babies. Just a quick apology to Ken McNab in part one, because I said he hadn't been on the show since 2019, but in fact he has. Sorry, I'd completely forgot about that. He was on with Kit O'Toole. I think that was 2020 from memory. I haven't checked back, but I think that was around the time of John Lennon's 80th birthday. I came up with this quite bizarre idea of counting down John Lennon's solo albums, but including Beatles albums, i.e. his contributions to them. I'll put that in the show notes as well. But the nice link was between his appearance in 2019, when we went month by month through 1969, and then almost exactly 4 years later, we're going back 6 years, but he's written another month by month book. So that's what I was feeling nostalgic about last time. Back in 2019, I was really finding my podcast feet, and it was part of a new and exciting adventure. It's not that I don't enjoy it still, but maybe after 4 years, I'm where the Beatles were about 4 years after they first entered the business. Not completely jaded though, don't worry. Just before I introduce the rest of my talk with Ken, a quick book recommendation, a book that I'm just finishing, Paul Denoyer's We All Shine On, The Stories Behind Every John Lennon Song, 1970 to 1980. It's quite a short book, and it's less extensive than Steve Turner's Beatles equivalent, let's say, A Hard Day's Right, because obviously there are less songs to deal with. But I like the writing style and the insights he has into John and his music, and there are also some great photos, so that's been an enjoyable and quite quick read. So, in this episode, Ken and I tackle July to December 63, starting with one of the seminal singles of their career, certainly their early career. A fantastic appearance on a TV show in Scandinavia. Hardcore fans will know what I'm talking about. And then continuing through a couple of appearances where they, if not join the establishment, they certainly rub shoulders with them. And one of the things I asked Ken later is whether John and the others, I'm sure they all didn't feel the same, even though they were a four-headed monster, whether they really enjoyed that. And of course, we'll never know really, but we can go by the evidence we've got, and then maybe some stuff we know about John Lennon in particular, stuff we've explored on Glass Onion. Ghosty in the 1962 show said that the Beatles are well steeped in the traditional and establishment side of Britain, and I wonder if one of the magics of the Beatles, that's not correct, magics. Magic is an uncountable noun, folks. What am I doing? Let's invent a countable version of magic. The tension between, or the juxtaposition of the traditional and softer side of music and entertainment with the harder edges of the Beatles, personality-wise, and their music. Obviously, the big stereotype is that Paul has the softer edge and John the harder, but we know that's not true, obviously. They both had both sides, really, and that's maybe why I like the White Album so much. One of the reasons, because it's the culmination of that. So you've got Honey Pie and Revolution 9, if not next to each other, then on the same side of the record, and you've got John and Paul both able to write and craft kids songs. On the White Album you've got Bungalow Bill, which is arguably a kids song with an adult theme, soft songs, tender songs, and then absolutely rock out harder than ever, arguably. You've got Paul with Helter Skelter, and then John reaching out to the dark depths of his soul that he explored in India with Yeah Blues. Anyway, why am I talking about 1968? I guess I want to say that the seeds of that soft, hard tension were maybe born in 63 or before that. I remember listening to a radio documentary with Tony Sheridan quoted on it. He, of course, was with the wilder version of the Beatles in Hamburg, and he heard their 1963 singles, the early singles with Oohs and Yeah, Yeah, Yeahs, and them in the quite tight-fitting and effeminate collarless cardan jackets, and was thinking, blimey, what's happened to the Beatles? They've been successful, but they've maybe lost something, some credibility. And Ken and I talk a bit later about the tension in John Lennon's rebel heart between the need for credibility and the need for success, and to avoid a straight working life, straight as in normal working life. We talk about another seminal single at the end of the year. Again, you'll know that one, hardcore fans. Probably my favourite of their early singles. And then we get to where they stand at the end of 63 with a trip to America planned and them on the cusp of quote-unquote world domination. I mentioned with Ghosty how they, in my opinion, they didn't conquer the world in 64, but we concluded that they conquered the English-speaking world. There's a few other things in here as well. I don't want to spoil it all, both in the Beatles world and the outside world, and I think you'll enjoy, as I always do, Ken's great positive energy, his unique accent and turns of phrase. There's lots of audio clips as ever, and I think you're going to enjoy this. If you'd like to help out the show, you can either do that by sharing links, telling people about the show, or financially there's a couple of links, PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. All help of any stripe is greatly appreciated. So that being said, I'll let you get on with listening, and I'll be back on the other side with a few words. Enjoy. Right, what I've got for sort of July and August. I mean, July they record She Loves You. Now, one of the other fascinating things about the book is that 1963 is a year where obviously this momentum is constantly building, and there's all these points where you kind of think this is the point of no return. And is it their first album? Not quite, because as you said, Fleet Street still weren't interested. Is it She Loves You? Is it the Palladium? I think She Loves You was maybe one of those turning points. How do you think it stacks up as a Beatles song? Would you put it top tier?
My preference is towards the later stuff, but when you listen to a song like She Loves You Again, it just hits you. It's just like cold water in your face first thing in the morning, and it's such a game-changing song, and it just illustrates musical terms, and you're more qualified than I am to talk about that, but it just seems such a leap forward from certainly the primitivism of Love Me Do, for example. It's such a game-changing song, and that intro, but you have to credit George Martin because his sonic experience, of deciding to open with the chorus rather than a verse. It's a masterpiece of a song. I still think it sounds really good today, and it was a chaotic day for them because there was a stampede of fans who managed to get inside the Warren is EMI studios and actually got into the session and had to be politely escorted from the building. It was a manic session, but really a milestone session, and what a song to come away with, really.
I mean, the thing that people have pointed out recently, and again, I feel silly because I didn't really dawn on me until like maybe recent years. John and Paul, okay, maybe they individually wrote songs and the other one finished it off. Obviously, the 63 singles were pretty eyeball to eyeball, nose to nose, whichever one you want to say. But of course, George and Ringo hadn't heard these songs, and they're being recorded very quickly. I mean, I'm not a drummer, but I guess there's a somewhat limited number of drum beats. But George is coming up with this iconic guitar, the riffs in She Loves You. Presumably, he didn't have too much time to do that, because the other thing that leaps out from your book, and I think this is true of 64, it's so breathless, isn't it? Everything is deadlines, deadlines, deadlines.
Yeah, I tried to capture some of that breathlessness, like a locomotive train chugging down the tracks. And, with each mile, it's getting faster and faster and building up to this unbelievable crescendo at the end of the year. I mean, it's interesting with a song like She Loves You. The session was on July the 1st, and it was only a couple of days earlier that the Lennon and McCartney are fine-tuning it in Paul's dad's house. And, of course, the famous, when Paul's dad hears the famous yeah, yeah, yeah refrain, he's puffing in his pipe or smoking a cigarette and said, would you not rather just say yes, yes, yes? Of course, the two of them crack up because obviously that's not how it's meant to be. It's easy with the passing of time to not recognise or not pay tribute to the contribution of George Harrison and Ringo Starr. Because, I mean, if you're hearing a song for the first time and you've got to think on your feet and say, okay then, so, I mean, first of all, you're thinking, well, what do I play? And how can I get on this record? And how can I provide a useful contribution? I mean, all these songs, all these great songs, you know, there's not a moment I can think of where George Harrison isn't a stellar contributor to the songs. And Ringo, She Loves You is a case in point with that thunderous intro. I mean, you know, we all talk about four sides of the square and that musketeer mantra. Well, in She Loves You, all the stars really came into proper alignment.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, I guess I slant towards the later stuff for sophistication, but I think what they maybe lost in the later years was that energy. I mean, there's a different type of energy. Obviously, if you compare, I saw her standing there and Back in the USSR, you know, they're both Paul vocals, they both start an album. Back in the USSR, it's got wonderful energy, but it's just a different energy, isn't it? It's not as breathless as these early singles. I mean, it's just a difference, isn't it? I don't think it's necessarily better or worse. It's just different.
No, I just think you're absolutely right that She Loves You just harnesses that kinetic energy of the young. I mean, I always think the Beatles come in different stages. You've got the young punks in Hamburg with that kind of energy that they had, and then you've got, you know, the guys from maybe 63 to 65, 66, and it's a different kind of energy. But in 1963, they are like a locomotive train, and, you know, with each different track, no pun intended, the momentum builds month by month.
Yeah, and of course, so you did mention George Martin as well, and apologies to fans of From Me to You, the single. I mean, we can't mention everything. It's just too much, you know, but that's obviously another seminal. I always think that's just slightly weaker than She Loves You, but famously it had that minor chord in the bridge that Paul was very proud of. So it's all progression. She Loves You comes out in August. I'll probably put a clip now of the football supporters at the Kop singing She Loves You. Here we go.
The music the crowd sings is the music that Liverpool has sent echoing around the world.
Have you got anything else from the summer? Maybe July, August?
Yeah, I was trying to highlight, I think of things that people maybe not fully aware of, to put things in some historical context. I mean, January, I meant to mention in January that while they're up in Scotland and trying to get together, you know, there's a young American in London filming a very small cameo for a BBC play, Bob Dylan. So Dylan was actually in London at the same time as these guys are trying to make their way. But for August, one of the things I thought was quite pivotal, and it's the same month as the famous Great Train Robbery took place, the Glasgow Royal Mail train, and the Ronnie Biggs of this world and Buster Edwards relieved it, not Phil Collins, but definitely Buster Edwards.
Yes.
Relieved the train of £2.5 million. It's also an interesting month for me because, again, the music is the music, but to take things, to set aside other things that took place, one of the most important things for me is that the photographer Robert Freeman takes the iconic image for the second album. And, you know, one thing about the Beatles is that from that second album onwards, these album covers are truly iconic pieces of art in themselves. And this is a case in point where, you know, everybody knows how the album cover looks, but when you're taking a picture, you don't know how it's going to look. And it was interesting to hear Robert Freeman's own recollections about how the photo session unfolded. It's also interesting to note how his recollections differ from, for example, Paul McCartney's recollections, even to the point of where it actually took place in a Bournemouth hotel. But, you know, I love that image of them. You know, it really captures them at that particular juncture. And also, interestingly enough, that again, when you do a bit of research, you realise that EMI were aghast when they saw this image and how it was being pitched by Brian Epstein as an album cover. And Brian had an important ally because George Martin also thought it was great. But EMI were absolutely appalled because all they could see staring back from what might have been Hades, from the darkness of hell.
Yeah.
4 mournful young guys, unsmiling and staring back at this bleakness. And it's interesting to know, Anthony, the talk was that not only did Brian Epstein want, and the Beatles themselves, it should be said, not only did they want that as the album cover, but they wanted it to go full bleed without even a name on the cover, without any reference to an album title. But we would have to wait 6 more years before somebody had the courage to greenlight that particular idea.
Oh, yes, I think we know which one that was, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, it's just very interesting to peel back. I mean, the Beatles are like not so much a glass onion, but certainly a conventional onion, because, you know, you're peeling back all these layers. And I think if you dig hard enough and you speak to people who are still around to be able to tell the stories, then you can still tease out stories from beneath the sediment of time and history.
Yes, that's right. The thing about it is that it's obviously a black and white cover. And I was thinking, because Please Please Me is obviously a colour cover, it's almost like, if you think of it as films, it's almost as if they'd made a colour short film and then gone back to black and white. And obviously the record company, you can understand, they're thinking, God, this looks so bleak. You know, they're not thinking of it in artistic terms, because generally, I mean, my friend Ghosty was on the show. He'll be upset if I don't mention that the Shadows actually had a black and white cover that wasn't a million miles away from it as well. So It had been done, and obviously Astrid's influence was there. But we'll get onto the album in a bit towards the end of the year. If we could move on to September, I definitely want to talk about George's trip to the US. He actually did a gig as well, and he was billed as the Elvis of England, wasn't he, as he came on. What I love about this is the idea that I don't know whether George felt in his heart that they were going to make it in America. I guess they probably thought they would eventually, or maybe they didn't, who knows. But it's this idea that he can go to America and be completely anonymous, and then literally, 5 months later, you know, he can't go anywhere in America without being torn to shreds. But what can you tell us just about his trip to the US? Obviously went to see his sister, didn't he?
Yeah, he went to see his sister in a town called Benton in Illinois.
That's right.
And they hadn't seen each other for a long time. And he was obviously, I mean, I think the Harrisons were a very close, typically close Liverpool family. And Louise Harrison had moved around with her husband. I think his name was Gordon. He was a Scottish engineer. And their current staging post was this very small town, an agricultural town. And George went out there with one of his brothers. And it really was probably the last time George Harrison was able to enjoy his anonymity.
Yeah.
And, you know, he went to a very normal holiday. But, you know, it was amazing for him because he's so young, but he actually had money in his pocket and he could actually go and afford to go to America. I mean, think about it. This is a time when very few Britons even went on any foreign holidays. It was Blackpool or somewhere, Great Yarmouth, that kind of
Skegness,
yes,
something like that.
Yes, absolutely. So the attraction of going to the Costa del Sol or Mallorca really was for only a very select few. So here you've got this young guy from Liverpool with some money in his pocket and enjoying the trip of a lifetime, really. And it's interesting to think that he was the first one to go. And he played well. He did strike up a friendship with another young guy who played in a local band. And they did go to a couple of places. They went to a music shop. Coincidence, actually, I think the town was called Mount Vernon, which is a coincidence for me because I live in a place in Glasgow called Mount Vernon.
Right.
George bought a guitar for, I think it was something like $400, which is an unbelievable price. And he paid cash. And he made such an impression on people, A, because of his accent, and B, because they thought his hair was long. Of course, when you look at the pictures nowadays, Antony, hair doesn't.
No, their hair was a little bit cropped in 63, actually. It got progressively longer. I always think of 1965 as the shaggy hair, you know. Did he make any effort to promote the Beatles when he was on that trip? Or was he actively maybe not wanting to do that because he wanted to be anonymous?
Well, Louise Harrison was the Beatles' biggest cheerleader, even in America, even in this tiny pocket of America. And I'm sitting here with a huge map of America here, and I did have Benton in Illinois marked on it. And now I can't find it, of course, because
I should know this. Is that Midwest? Or?
It is Midwest, yeah.
It is Midwest, which doesn't narrow it down that much because the Midwest is absolutely huge.
But no, yes. and of course I am an old git. But
you're getting younger every year in spirit, though, aren't you?
Tell me that. See, when I die, they'll not look at my birth certificate. They'll just cut me open and count the rings. But there was one particular young girl called, I think her name was Maria Schaefer. And she had played the Beatles on like a school radio show. And Louise persuaded George that perhaps it might be good publicity for him to go and talk to this young girl. And George turned up at the school only to find that Maria had gone. But somebody managed to get in touch with her. She came back and she carried out a very quick interview with him for the school radio show. She was a fan, but, they had no exposure. Nobody played them on the radio. The record companies, Capitol in America, didn't want anything to do with them, which is why they ended up on the likes of Swan, for example, these remote outpost labels. And so nobody was interested, but it's a pity because that would have been a very interesting tape to hear, but it's long gone, I'm afraid, and nobody's kept a copy of it. But again, when he sat in with the local band, he didn't want to play any Beatles songs, and he played a lot of country and western songs. Chet Atkins, maybe. And
I think you said he played Your Cheating Heart by Hank Williams.
He was very reluctant to get up on stage, and I think it was his brother who said, if he actually put a guitar in his hand, he'll probably go. And apparently he went down a storm.
No, I bet, yeah.
I mean, can you imagine what that must have been like? I've not seen any photographs of that. More's the pity.
No.
Because who would know to keep a record of that? But by all accounts, can you imagine this young guy getting up with his guitar, playing these great songs like Your Cheating Heart? They were absolutely blown away. And somebody did come up to him afterwards and said that, you should stick in with that guitar, son, because, you're not bad.
You'll go far. And he's like, we've already gone far in England, He'd already gone far, but
it was a bit of an eye-opener.
Just not in America. Yeah.
It was a bit of an eye-opener, Antony, because nobody had heard of them. He went to local record shops and he would leaf through the record racks, and he came back with a whole bundle of albums. But it's interesting that he rounded the trip off by going to New York and going to the Empire, like any other tourist, and going to the top of the Empire State Buildings. And I'm sure many people have seen the pictures of him with his very thin tie, larking about like any other normal person. But 4 or 5 months later, their world had changed.
That's it. They're at the Plaza Hotel, which you may have gone past. Yep. Anything else? Yeah, we're not doing too badly. We're on 1 hour 45. Not too bad. We're in September.
I just wanted to mention very briefly that in September they did an interview for the Daily Mirror with a guy called Donald Zeck, very famous features writer at the time. And this is at a time when newspapers held great sway in the court of popular public opinion. They sold in their millions, really. They were the most popular and effective methods of communication. But when the Beatles sat down for an interview with Donald Zeck, he was a good, 20 years older than them. And it shows, I mean, nowadays, there's 30 years between me and my son, but, you don't feel that distance, really. But when you look at pictures back then of older people and young people, there's a definite chasm there. I mean, you're only talking about, less than 20 years since the end of the Second World War, and that generational shift hasn't quite happened yet. So when Donald Zeck sits down with them, his interview, when it's published, is laced with sarcasm. He's really mocking them as much as anything, and it does shine through in the text. And it's worthwhile reproducing some of that language to illustrate how the older generation dismissed the young. I mean, that's always been the case. He was very dismissive of them, as I say, very sarcastic. But the one person who wasn't fazed by it in the slightest was Tony Barrow, because Tony Barrow, that was Zeck's writing style, to be very sardonic, and he said he would have been disappointed. Tony Barrow took the view that there was no such thing as bad publicity. And the interesting thing for me, Antony, is that this is September 63, where they're getting a double-page spread in what at that time was Britain's biggest selling paper, probably the Daily Express, maybe, I don't know. But that kind of exposure is valuable. And yet, a couple of months later, when everybody's clamouring to get the Beatles on the front page. There's an argument for saying that before the end of the year, the Beatles had actually triggered Britain's very first tabloid circulation war between the Mirror, the fledgling Sun, the Daily Mail and the Daily Express. Because everybody wanted a piece of them.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, something you said earlier as well, when you're saying the generation gap's not quite the same, there's definitely something that's happened in the last 20 years in that you can't tell people's ages quite like you used to, you know, because the way people dress, we all dress a bit more similarly than back in the past and things like that. So that's definitely been a change. But did you mention, I think you mentioned Dibs Mather in your book. I feel like you did. And there's a radio show. I'll try and put a clip if I can. There's a very John Lennon-esque, well, not John Lennon-esque, it is John Lennon. There's an interesting exchange where he asks them a few questions and they're deadpanning it.
You were interested in poetry at school.
Who said?
It's printed in a book compiled by the Beatles and entitled The Beatles.
I haven't read that book. We don't normally write those things. You can tell they're all written by the same person anyway.
Well, it said simply that you write comic poetry if the mood takes you about something that takes your fancy.
Oh, yeah. I'll do that.
Written any good comic poems lately?
Yes, sir.
I just happen to have here by sheerest coincidence.
Dressed in my brown... Oh, no, I've lost it. Hold on. I can't read it, see, I've only just written it. Well, that's how it starts, actually. Dressed in my teen old brown sweater, I easily mixed with the crowd at Neville Club. I see me ho. Soon, all but soon, people acoustic me saying such thing as, "Where the charge, man?" I'm turning over. All too soon, I notice boys and girls sitting in a hobbled lump, smoking hernia and taking Odeon and getting very high. Hold on, some were only 4'3" high, but he had Indian hump, which he grew in his sleep. Puffing and globbering, they drugged themselves, rampling and dancing with wild abdomen, stubbing wheeled costumes amongst themselves. They seemed Olivier to the world about them. I won't go on because I can't hardly read it.
It's far enough. It
ends up. A coloured man danced by eating a banana, or was it his finger? In his left hand, a little old woman turned out to be his mother. The end. But things like that just help me keep sane.
Is this business enough to drive you insane?
No, I'm quite normal, really. If you read in the Beatle books, it says I'm quite normal.
It said, John Lennon, that you have the most goon-type humour of the four Beatles.
Who said that?
I think I read it in one of the newspapers.
And he says, "Oh, this is all going wrong. I want to get a nice personality profile." And John Lennon says,
"I haven't got a nice personality."
What kind of personality would you say you have?
Very nice.
What sort of personality have you got then? Very nice.
Yeah,
you know, it's very John Lennon, you know.
Typical John. I think it depends who they spoke to, and I think their attitude towards the regional press was much more welcoming. I think they were very wary of the national press. I mean, there's an element of novelty to it. I mean, they're much more comfortable with the music guys, but Paul McCartney would always be, you know, Mr. PR. I think he was able to handle it, but John, if he got bored, you know, nobody wants to bandy words with John Lennon. There's no greater wordsmith kicking around than John Lennon. He was quite capable of letting off a volley if it came to it.
Yeah, king of the put-downs, wasn't he? All right. Oh, God, I feel bad. I don't want to gloss over the last few months because they're so important, but obviously we want people to buy the book and read it, so we don't want to give too much away. But obviously October is Palladium. In the anthology, Ringo obviously talks about one of his relatives said, you know, get to the Palladium, see your name in lights. You just can't play down how significant that was. One thing I wanted to talk about, a nice segue from September, because we were talking about George and this anonymity thing. Over the last few years, I've started to feel that there's a very clear split where it seems like John and George are the ones that resent the intrusion into their lives, and Paul and Ringo are, I mean, obviously they're still doing it now. They're a bit more tolerant of the showbiz game, let's say. And I really feel like I wanted to use the word trauma because I really feel that in 66, after they stopped, there was a PTSD element.
Yeah.
Very much with John, because I've read a lot about John, but it seems like George as well, because back in the day when Richard Buskin and Robert Rodriguez used to do this Something About the Beatles podcast together, they opened my eyes to so many things. It was around the first wave of Beatles podcasts, very much pre-Glass Onion. And they kind of introduced the idea to me of Spiky George, because I never thought of George as too spiky. And I think George had a chip on his shoulder as well. And I think it comes from this period. Can you give us an idea of how mad it was? You know, maybe it wasn't as mad as it was in America, but...
By the time you get to the Palladium, Beatlemania is virtually ready to explode all over the country as a result of the Palladium gig. Because I touched on it a minute ago about the press go along to the likes of the Palladium and they're hand-fed a couple of nice quotes. And then when the bedlam starts, you know, one journalist realises what's going on and decides to phone the desk. And then, of course, the rest of them think, oh, well, maybe we should do the same. You know, George didn't want to become a prisoner of his fame early on.
Well, it seems to me that after your show, your real problems really begin. What's it like with these fans outside, Paul?
At first, it's murder, because, you know, it looks as though they're going to tear you apart. Once you get the hang of it, you get used to it, and things get to be easier.
Have you ever been in physical danger from your fans?
Well, occasionally, yes. Only when there's been a big mob, you know, a really big one. But usually they're quite nice if there's only a few at a time when you meet them.
Yeah. What is it? Do you deliberately try and create these sort of screaming reactions?
No, we just, you know, arrive at the theatre and they're always there waiting. And whenever we're doing a show, the police always come and say, don't look out the window, you know, because you excite them. I'm dying to look out.
They talked quite a lot about how long it would last before, in quotes, the bubble bursts. You know, George was, you know, for all he was the youngest, I think there was a definite maturity there. You know, he, in his early interviews in these months and that year, George displays a maturity which maybe some people don't always give him credit for. He can see through the, you know, the falseness of it all. And he was also the one later in the year that actually walked out of a show because they were asked to perform in what was essentially a cage.
Oh, yes, yes.
George was the first mutineer, if you like, and he said, I didn't learn to play the guitar or to be in a band to play in a cage, and he walked out. And interestingly, the one who followed him was John Lennon, and said, well, if he's going, I'm going as well. So George was very much an individual, I think, and could be quite spiky. I don't think even in these early days he suffered fools gladly.
He was also the one who refused the ticker tape parade, didn't he, in America, because it was just after Kennedy had died. Yeah, interesting. I mean, I feel like with the Palladium, there's not too much more we can say. I mean, I think people know, obviously, that was the point of no return, I suppose. So you got She Loves You, and then that, and then the Royal Variety. But October the 17th, we get a pretty important day in the studio. They record, I believe they recorded I Want to Hold Your Hand and This Boy, the B-side, on the same day.
Take 12. Just to love you. But I'm not this boy, that boy, Joe. This boy, that boy, that boy. This boy, that boy. Take 13. This boy. That's boy.
And then they did the Christmas record. I'm sure you know, and the listeners don't need me to tell you, if you play the Christmas records back to back, that is kind of the Beatles' career, isn't it?
Yeah.
It starts quite formulaic, gets experimental in the middle, and then by the end they're recording separately. It's really interesting. I love it. Is that right? They recorded both sides on the same day, and I think you wrote Norman Smith, who John Lennon used to call Normal. When he heard the This Boy harmonies, he kind of got goosebumps, and that would happen a lot, I think, over the years, wouldn't it, in the studio?
Yeah, I mean, I think This Boy, I mean, that's one of their greatest singles. I mean, people forget that the B-sides, how unbelievably good the B-sides are. Yeah. I Want to Hold Your Hand and This Boy. There's an argument, a compelling argument for saying you could have flipped them round and it would still have been relatively successful. Although I think I Want to Hold Your Hand is probably the stronger. But the harmonies for This Boy are really incredible. One of the things that stands out for me in October, Antony, you touched on it earlier, the tour to Sweden.
Oh, yes, tell us.
But just from the point of view that it's a very odd place to go to, you know, for your first foreign, in inverted commas, tour. But I think it was an important tour because over the 6 or 7 days that they were there, they were playing to crowds of between 600 and 1,500. But some of the performances that have been recorded from that tour, because they're not screaming, they're kind of watching them. And some of the performances in that tour, I think Rolling Stone called one of them one of the greatest live performances ever. And you wouldn't imagine that of a band like the Beatles at that particular point. But if you've heard the recordings, it's easy to understand where Rolling Stone were coming from, because there's such a power, that unvarnished rawness in the songs that they played. And the guys behind the mixing desk, their meters were way into the red, and they almost apologised because they felt that it was too high. But the Beatles loved that sound, that just the sheer volume that they played at. And they sound fantastic, because obviously you can hear them play, which is a big... It drives a truck through the suggestion that even by that time, as a live band, the rough edges had been smoothed out. They couldn't hear themselves. But on occasions like the Swedish tour, they sound absolutely fantastic, especially when they were asked to play an encore and they decide to do one off the cuff. But, they could play anything at that time. They knew they knew their songs.
They're still putting a lot into them, but I know.
Yeah, I mean, they never dialed it in. They never dialed in a performance. But on that particular occasion, and they're met by about 20 fans at the airport when they land in, I think it was Stockholm. It's amazing to think that they did have a following in Scandinavia even at that point. But the interesting thing is that, as I say, that they're met by about 20 fans when they land, but see, when they come back to London, they're under siege. There are thousands of fans lining the airport, and it's such a transformative moment. They land at the airport, and there are thousands of kids, their noses pressed against the windows, screaming at the top of their voices. But it's very difficult to deal with that. I mean, how do you deal with it? The one person that wasn't there, of course, was Ed Sullivan. I'm not convinced by that in the slightest, Ed.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you don't mind, we won't go through that now. Yeah. There's a slow creep towards America, and the interesting thing also, they're muting the idea of a film. Mooting or muting? No, mooting the idea of a film. Anyway, you'll have to get the book to read about that, folks. The Ed Sullivan myth. But yeah, the drop-in show they did in Sweden. We did a show about John Lennon and Beatles live, and my guest Chris was gushing about that show. I mean, we got some video of that. That's Sweden, I'm sure it is, isn't it? There's a bit of video of that.
There is a video for that. I think that.
I mean, they're just fantastic. Like I said earlier, it's the 1963 raw, but also polished and professional at the same time, and you just got the balance.
Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the guy who helped to instigate the gig. He was over in England in the summer and saw them, and it was his instigation that they went over there. He was very much a TV personality and radio personality, and he was knocked out by how good they were.
We'll let the listeners shout his name out to their iPods as they're listening to us. You go ahead, listeners. It's him. Anyway.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We'd like to carry on now with the song. Before we do, we'd like to ask you if you'd join in with us. Join in. If you will, as we sing the song, just clap your hands, or if you want to, stamp your feet on the floor, but just make a noise. Okay? You do that?
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Okay then, the song, Twist and Shout.
You know you look so good.
One more number, please.
Can we go to November?
Yeah.
Okay with that?
Cool.
All right. So obviously we got the Royal Variety Show. Now, do you think they enjoyed the Royal Variety Show? Is there a little bit of a split? John Lennon obviously got to say "rattle your jewellery." He missed out one word from what he originally was going to say, didn't he? But
I think there's a slight difference. There's a slight difference between the Palladium show and the Royal Variety performance. The Palladium show is their kind of, there's a lot of ordinary Beatles fans in the audience and they're screaming.
Okay.
With the Royal Variety performance in November, the audience is much more differential, and I think with the Royal Variety performances, that Marlene Dietrich tops the bill.
Yes.
And, she looks stunning, even at the age of 63, I think she was then. Ringo's eyes are out in stocks. But I think the Royal Variety performance is nevertheless an important performance, not just because of the famous quips. And incidentally, they sound really good. Their performances are excellent. McCartney's savvy enough to throw in one for the older generation, if you like. And again, Twist and Shout just is raucous. I think it's an important performance because, again, that show's beamed into people's homes. Not everybody has a television set, but it's a growing medium, even if it's still relatively in its infancy. But the important thing, I think, for me is that performance introduces the Beatles to a parental audience. Palladium as well, it's a mainstay of British entertainment. It had been on television for a couple of years, but I think with the Royal Variety performance, it lent a sheen of credibility to the Beatles and made them less threatening in the eyes of parents. If they can appear before the good old Queen Mum and Princess Margaret, they must be, in inverted commas, nice boys. But, you can understand why behind the scenes Lennon and probably George were through gritted teeth. We've all heard the story about what John was really going to say. I mean, let's be honest, do you think he would say that? I don't think so.
No.
It's a bit of youthful bravado, but I don't think he would have said it. He said it to shock Epstein. But it's a nice story, and why let the facts get in the way?
Yeah, print the legend.
There's a couple of things from the Royal Variety performance that I did find quite interesting. Burt Bacharach, I think, was Marlene Dietrich's, if you like, musical director. And he did, correct me if I'm wrong, was it Baby It's You? He was a co-writer for. So it's interesting that coincidence. In the orchestra was a trumpet player, I think, called Ross McManus. It's hardly really made any great impact in musical history, but his son certainly has, because his son is Declan McManus, better known, as we all know, as Elvis Costello. And Elvis's old man comes back from the show, and young Declan, rather, is a huge Beatles fan, and when his dad finally rocks home in the early hours, probably after having been to the après party, first thing that young Declan says to his dad, is, did you meet the Beatles? And eventually, after teasing him for a few minutes, the old man produces a bit of paper, and he's got all 4 Beatles signatures on it. Yes. So this is obviously, a wow moment for any kid, But as Declan morphed into Elvis, unfortunately, that particular scrap of paper, young Declan took a pair of scissors to it, as he himself said, not very accurately, and cut them all up. So, amazing, really. But it's an amazing coincidence when you consider that as Elvis Costello, he worked so closely with Paul McCartney in later years because they thought there was an element of John Lennon in there, another interesting element of the Fab Four Venn diagram.
There you go. Yeah, very good. Yeah, I think John Lennon was kind of torn, wasn't he? Because definitely regarding the Royal Variety, in one way it's everything he hates.
John, in this Royal Variety Show, when you're appearing before royalty, your language has got to be pretty good, obviously. This thing about Ted, he's saying that he couldn't distinguish.
I can't understand
the Queen's English.
I can't understand Teddy saying that at all, really. I'm not going to vote for Ted.
But you're not going to change your act just for the Lord Privy Seal?
Oh, no, we'll keep, the same kind of thing, won't we?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
But I don't know if this story came from him, but there's some idea that he made a pact with Brian Epstein. If you make me famous, I'll do whatever you want, basically. Because what John Lennon, I think, wanted to do was escape, quote unquote, normal job. Mm-hmm. And Mimi tried to get him on a bus conductor's training session or something like that. I can't remember what it was, but some training course. And he's like, no, I'm not doing that.
I'm not doing that.
The irony, of course, is that John Lennon wanted a job where he didn't have a boss and he didn't have someone leaning on him, putting pressure. And what does he end up? He didn't want a job where he had to get up early and was tired and had a boss on his back. And what did he end up doing? Legging it around the country with a record company boss going, can we have the next big hit, please, John and Paul? We'll give you 2 weeks or whatever it was.
It must have been really difficult for him, As I said, he's somebody with a rebel heart and a non-conformist. But, maybe he recognised that sometimes you have to kiss a lot of frogs to find a prince. I mean, as he said in interviews round about that time, actually, they could last 5 months or 5 years and never be heard of again. And he then might have had to succumb to that 9-to-5 job that that prospect was anathema to him.
How long are you going to last? Well, you can't say, You can be big-headed and say, yeah, we're going to last 10 years. But as soon as you've said that, you think, we're lucky if we last 3 months,
Like I say, he had that pragmatic, practical side. On the last show, we were talking about the Big Three, it was a Liverpool band. And John Gustafson from the Big Three, he talked about the Beatles, quote-unquote, middle-class thinking. And what he meant, it wasn't so much a class thing as more forward-thinking, playing the game and being smart enough to play the game. Because I think the Big Three were more sort of, they wanted enough money to have a few beers after the show, and they didn't think forward. There wasn't a lot of forward thinking. I think with the Beatles there was, and John Lennon was a smart guy. He'd read a lot of books and he was innately quite intelligent. He always had those two things pulling against him, like you said, the rebel, the artist, but there was a practical guy in there as well. All right, we have finally found our way to December. What would you like to talk about with December?
What I would mention in December is that, again, set against the backdrop of history. If you get to December 1963, Antony, you're talking about only 8 days since John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And it's a pivotal moment in history, not just the 1960s, but of history in itself. And I actually referenced back in the June chapter, again, to try and set the scene, if you like, and paint a picture with words, that in June, among the many things that were taking place, there's a Pope died in June, and I think he was Pope John, that he was succeeded by Pope Paul, which I thought was yes. Of all the names, of all the joints in all the world.
Yeah, I don't think Pope George or Pope Ringo got a look in.
I don't think that's going to happen. But, during that month, the foundations were laid. I think Lyndon Johnson went to Dallas and laid the foundations for Kennedy's visit to that city in November. I'm sure people will know that the Beatles' second album actually came out on the same day that Kennedy was killed.
Yes.
So the interesting thing for December for me is, again, one of these unbelievable twists of fate. It happens like this, that on December the 10th, Walter Cronkite, who famously was the man who really told America the president was dead just a couple of weeks earlier. And the interesting thing is that on the 22nd of November, Walter Cronkite's show began that morning with a segment of this new band from Britain, which was getting unbelievable reaction. And they showed a very small clip of them playing in Bournemouth, I think, from the summer. This was not meant as a tribute. This was really one of those segments that you put on the end of a show, really to mock them. The girls in the office in Walter Cronkite's office were laughing at them, and the guy who introduced it from London, he was just taking the piss, really. He certainly wasn't lauding them as the next big thing. He thought it was very much a sort of English eccentricity, if you like. The length of their hair, the screams, the yes, and they were really just there to mock them as much as anything. Anyway, if we fast forward on from the 2 or 3 weeks since Kennedy was shot, and America really is still understandably cloaked in this, if you like, an elegiac black veil. Flags are at half-mast in all the buildings, and the country's really still mourning, quite rightly, the loss of their young president, a guy who was a beacon of hope for the free world and young people as well, it should be said. So, Walter Cronkite is faced with this dilemma about having to broadcast grim news every day, which is a turn-off for anybody. And then somewhere in the back of his mind, Antony, he suddenly remembers that clip that they showed for that first time only. And the idea was that initially they were going to, repeat it throughout the day. But when Kennedy's assassination came in and everything else was canned, and the Beatles segment, the piece of film was rolled up into a canister and locked away in a dusty cupboard, never to be seen again. And as I say, 2 or 3 weeks later, Cronkite suddenly realises that, remembers the footage and remembers the reaction that it got because it made people laugh. So, he goes and he gets the footage and has a look at it, and they decide that they'll repeat it again. He didn't rate them at all. He's an older guy from a different generation. What do you like? But the interesting thing was that when that footage was aired again, there was a young girl in Washington called Marcia Albert who saw it for the first time and was absolutely mesmerised by the sound of the Beatles. It was an important moment because, again, it's like the Beatles butterfly effect. As I say, fate sometimes steps in when you least expect it. And this young teenage girl, she went to sleep thinking about the Beatles, and she woke up the next morning thinking about the Beatles, and she decided to do something very important, which she'd never done before, which was to write to her favourite DJ and ask him why it was that American radio didn't play bands like the Beatles. And the guy's name was Carol James, wasn't it? And he saw the letter, and he decided to carry out his own investigations and, to cut a story short, managed to get an imported copy of I Want to Hold Your Hand and played it on his show. The switchboard lit up, and that was really the moment when, it certainly helped to change the minds of executives at Capitol who'd were already thinking that they'd made a dreadful mistake by snubbing the Beatles throughout the rest of the year. But it's just an interesting domino effect whereby this young girl, she actually introduced the single on Carol James' show, and it's a pivotal moment.
So Marcia Albert of Dublin Drive of Silver Spring has the honor of introducing something brand new, an exclusive, here at WWDC. Marcia, the microphone here on the Carol James Show is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time on the air in the United States, here are the Beatles singing I Want to Hold Your Hand.
So other than in September, so you said they were played on the radio, local radio in September when George was there, but this was their first proper airplay, right?
Yeah, I mean, the one in September was really just a school. I mean, it was really just very small beer.
We should circle back just very briefly with the Beatles. Do you prefer it to Please Please Me? Is it progression? Is it more of the same, or what do you think?
I actually prefer the first album to the second.
Oh, okay.
I think there's some great moments in the second album. John Lennon's version of Smokey Robinson's, is it Smokey Robinson? It's simply magnificent. Can't Buy Me Love, is that on it?
No, All My Loving.
All My Loving, sorry, that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah,
My Loving is a magnificent frozen in time moment. It just signposts really Paul McCartney's melodic genius. I think it's a good album, but not a great album. If I have to rank all the Beatles albums from 1 to whatever, it probably wouldn't be top 5 for me. But there are some truly brilliant moments on it.
And they had a kind of a formula, and I don't think of it in a bad way, but if you think of I Saw Her Standing There starts the first album, and the second album starts with a song that they never played live, which I think is totally bizarre. It Won't Be Long. I can imagine that'd be a brilliant live song. And then you've got, obviously, John ended the first one with Twist and Shout, and now he ends it with Money, which is of a piece. You've got George does Devil in Her Heart, where he did Chains, both girl group songs, I believe. So they got a formula. Ringo gets a song, obviously, I Want to Be Your Man. And I mean, I think it's probably just about a progression, but I like both of those. I think for me, the John standouts, you've got Please Mr. Postman, You Really Got a Hold on Me. I really love those. I think he did that Motown stuff.
You've really got a hold on me is you don't think of it as a cover. I just think it's. I think the Beatles had an incredible. I was talking to my wife about this, about taking other people's songs and really making them their own, and you just automatically think that they're Beatles songs. I mean, Money comes into that category as well. They had an unbelievable knack of ending with barnstorming songs. I'm thinking, Who Never Knows, for example, Day in the Life.
You made me think of something when you're saying they're doing these covers. They kind of Beatle them up years later when they did Free as a Bird and they'd finished it, George, of course, said, "Oh, it sounds like a Beatles song."
I know.
Because they turned Free as a Bird into a Beatles song, into a quote Beatles song.
With the second album, I think you can tell that George Martin really has got his hand very firmly on the tiller, and understandably, he's the grown-up, and they would always defer to him. How quickly that would change.
Plus, he's playing on their songs already, because on Please Please Me, he played on Misery.
Yeah.
He played that sort of piano flourish, and now he plays I really love his piano on Money.
Oh, it's magnificent.
Dun, 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 dun. No, I mean, they're lucky. I mean, they got the right guy. As you're saying earlier, he liked the With the Beatles cover, as in the album cover. They got the right guys, and obviously a year later they'd get absolutely the right film director in Dick Lester. So, I mean, it's like all these things. It's talent plus luck, isn't it?
That relationship with George Martin was pivotal, and it's a two-way thing. He obviously liked them. George Martin had already recognised throughout 1963 that there was some longevity here, that Lennon McCartney had a genuine talent, because, he just kept on saying to him, I need you to bring me something that's better than the last one. I mean, this is the thing, that in a year like 1963, that output 2 albums, 4 singles, something like 4 UK tours, at the Palladium shows, the Royal Variety Performance. I mean, it's an unbelievable a sort of jump-off point for what was to follow. They were really on the cusp of something special. And as you mentioned earlier, quite rightly, this youthful energy, there just seemed to be they were relentless.
Absolutely, yep. Right, Ken, I'm going to bring this to an end. I'm going to kind of go to my own formula. If you remember 4 years ago, was it 40 years ago you were on last time? Probably feels like 40, isn't it? But it was 4 years ago you were on. I got you to read a little bit of the end of And in the End. And have you got your copy there?
Yeah, I've got it here.
Right, if you go to page 375, please.
75, yeah.
This is towards the end of the book, but it's almost like the Titanic story. We're not quite spoiling the ending because we know it. Well, it doesn't end up like the Titanic, obviously. It ends up very well. But you have an epilogue, which we're not going to read now, but where you talk about 64, so you're kind of bringing us in. But could you read 3 paragraphs starting from By New Year's Eve?
Sure.
And I'll just set it up. We're talking about I Want to Hold Your Hand, and then obviously it's just about to be released in America. I believe it was Boxing Day. So if you wouldn't mind with your dulcet tones, just read 3 paragraphs from there down to Most Storied Band.
Yeah, no problem. Just seems to...
Here is Ken McNab live from Scotland, everybody.
Okay, guys, this is a small extract from the book, the book called Shake It Up, Baby, and it's actually almost a mirror image of how I ended And in the End, and that was deliberate because it was a month-by-month narrative. So, as long as you can understand my Scottish brogue.
And by the way, we're a bit low on studio time, so you only get 1 take. There's no time for it was a joke. I was emulating the Please Please.
Twist and shout moment.
Yes, a twist and shout moment.
Right, here we go. And again, the context is December 63. So, by New Year's Eve, the single, this perfect distillation of the Beatles in their purest form, had sold 500,000 copies in the US. In London, meanwhile, a perfect piece of Beatle symmetry was being held up to the mirror. Exactly 365 days since they exited Hamburg's Star Club with a set list that included Money, open brackets, That's What I Want, close brackets. The same song would feature in the proper concert that followed the 6th night of their review-flavoured Christmas show at the Finsbury Park Astoria. In a few hours, 6 miles away, the chimes of Big Ben would peal out across Britain's capital city, a celebration for a new year and a moment for the Beatles and all those around them to pause for reflection. 4 number 1 singles, 2 number 1 albums, 2 best-selling EPs, 4 momentum-gathering UK tours, an amazing 287 live shows, 49 radio appearances, and 35 TV appearances, winning the hearts and minds of a nation, including royalty. It all added up to a cultural tsunami that would simply never be repeated by those who worshipped them and those who followed. For George Martin, it had been an epic and back-breaking 12 months that had reaped an unprecedented reward. I never worked as hard in my life as I did in 1963, he said. For Dick James, a fledgling publisher who some 15 months earlier had been on his financial uppers, the songs of Lennon and McCartney had brought about a stunning reversal of fortunes. Brian Epstein, meanwhile, had discovered his true calling in life as a pop impresario and the spiritual fifth Beatle. And John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr, that homespun hierarchy so revered by antiquity, were on the long and winding road to becoming the band, or the act rather, you've known for all these years, and history's most storied band.
Thank you very much. Well, who wrote that? That's very good, Ken. Did you write that? Yeah, you did.
Sorry, a tight-lipped spokesman refused to confirm or deny.
So it's Shake It Up, Baby, The Rise of Beatlemania and the Mayhem of 1963. Is the book actually out yet? Where is it?
The book has just come out this month, so with a nice wind behind it, then hopefully people will like it. But I enjoy doing it. You know, whether I'll do another one, I don't know. I wasn't really intending to do another book. But, you know, I think the important thing is if you can bring some context to it, you can speak to people. There's lots of interviews in there of people who were around at the time, BBC producers, fan club people, which was quite interesting. So, and as I say, set against all the maelstrom of political, social and cultural change that was happening for young people around about that time.
It's so strange, isn't it? Because if you compare it with 69, maybe one day I'll listen back to our conversation, but it's so different. And while I was reading your book, I've just been researching a 1967 show, and I think we're going to end up recording probably 5-6 hours on that over about 3 Skype chats. But 67 is so different as well, because it's different from 69. It's different from 63, you know. It's amazing. Each Beatle year's got its own character, hasn't it?
It does. I mean, I have toyed with the idea of carrying on and doing, but I mean, I don't think I've got enough years left in me to do it. And obviously one or two people have done it. I think Steve Turner did a 66 book, which is very
very good. Yeah,
very good. Book, so whether you could improve on that, I don't know. So I don't know. You know, it takes a lot of energy and a lot of research, a lot of homework. I'm quite sure that you don't get everything right. Mark Lewison once said that when he does his books that if he gets 90% of things right, and he's such a forensic chronicler of history, then you're doing quite well. So my fingers are crossed, and sometimes I don't want to look at it in case oh God, no, help me.
Yeah, well, I think Mark said that. Yeah, he said since Tune In's come out, which is obviously 10 years ago now, he said, you know, he has found a couple of things, but you can't worry about it, honestly. Don't go back and constantly revise it. Eh?
No, it would. I mean, I lie awake at night and think about lawyers. That's another story.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing to do with the book, thankfully. Well, not yet.
So have you got any other projects? You hinted at the beginning, anything?
Well, I'd like to do something that hasn't been done before, and I've always been intrigued about the relationship between John and Paul. If you look at their relationship in like a 5-part play, where you've got those early years where they first met in 57 until 62, then you've got the first rush of Beatlemania from 63 to 66, then from 67 to 70, then you've got the 70s to obviously 1980. And if you think about it, you know, the relationship is really remarkable. And even today, you know, I've obviously seen the Glastonbury show, and I've seen all the footage where John's in the background, and McCartney clearly still loves him. And it's that love. As a Scots guy, we don't really talk about love very good. We're not very good at that. But these are two guys that really loved each other, and I don't think anybody's really explored that dynamic about what made it work. So I'm looking at it just now. I mean, even throughout the 70s, where there was obviously things were not great, but I think sometimes, Antony, you can only really have that kind of antagonism to somebody if you really love them the way that they did, And I mean, I've been some things recently with Alice Cooper and various other people from around that time, Mickey Dolenz, that would say that if you were in John's company, you could not possibly slate McCartney in any shape or form because John would come down on you like a ton of bricks. And it's very much a case of, it's all right for me to criticise McCartney, but don't you do it, because he's my friend. Obviously, post-1980, there were lots of things that happened over the songwriting credits, the frostiness with Yoko, and obviously John's not there, but his spirit kind of hangs over Paul, I think, and it's maybe not until the anthology that maybe his own feelings were reconciled. But when you listen to him now, and I know it's easy to say it in the light of what happened, but I think Paul McCartney and John Lennon genuinely loved each other. I don't know. It's difficult to do something that hasn't been done. And is anybody really interested? At the end of the day, you do these things because you hope people will like them and maybe gain something from them. And so it's not enough for me to chunter on and say, oh, well, But I don't think it's really been done about the embodiment of that relationship, the finely tuned nuance of why did it work? I was reading Jim O'Donnell's book the other night, the one about when John...
the day that John met Paul. I love that book, yeah.
It's interesting, but I mean, it takes imagination and hits it with a 6-iron, whereas you'd want to be able to speak to people. But as I said earlier, time's marching on, and I don't know, normally things come... The structure of a book, you asked earlier on about how you do it, the structure of it kind of comes quite quickly. But with this, I don't know whether I'm barking up the wrong tree or whether I'm just actually barking.
Yeah, I mean, you're lucky in a way you got your book in, didn't you? The one we've been talking about today. Because like I say, unfortunately, these guys are not going to be around forever, are they?
No.
Probably Paul will be, but...
I tell you,
Ringo looks younger, doesn't he, with his jet black hair?
Oh, good luck to him. If he wants to do it, he's earned it, I mean, if there was one book, if you could choose a book that hasn't been written, would it be?
Me?
Yeah.
I think, and a few Beatles people have said this, some sort of psychological analysis, but using maybe someone who has psychological credentials. I've got a PhD in coffee table psychology. I awarded it to myself. I didn't go to university for it. I was going to say, actually, while you're talking, I read a Freudian analysis. John Stewart, who was in the band Sleeper. Please try and read this book in the future. Dylan, Lennon, Marx and God. He was on the show. And he recommended a book called The Beatles with Lacan. And I think John and Paul, I think it's deep enough to warrant Freudian analysis. So I think some sort of psychological analysis, that's what I'd be looking for.
Well, I definitely considered that. I mean, I wrote down things and I thought, well, you would have to get somebody to look at them, as you say, from that psychological profile and to examine exactly where the feelings came from, with it, So that was definitely in my thinking, in a sense, So I don't know, but to do something that hasn't been done, and at the same time, is it unfair to do Lennon McCartney and leave out George Harrison and Ringo Starr? But I do think that the relationship, and I think the songs will stand the test of time. I mean, people still listen to Mozart 200 odd years after he's gone, and I think the songs will stand up.
Oh, absolutely, they will. But I'm a musician. I can tell you, it's a combination of melody and harmony.
And in that context,
that's the key. Plus the words, obviously, as well.
In that context, how important are they, and do people care? And would it have any merit whatsoever? So I don't know. I've got some time off soon, and I'm not very good at taking holidays, but I'm going to give it some thought. Much to my wife's, I can see the despair already when I'm sitting there with a notepad and pens and.
Is that like a compulsive thing, though? Would you be a person who carries around a notepad at all times, or not?
Yeah, probably.
I'm a bit like that as well. I'm a great diarist. I mean, I'm never going to publish my diaries, but I find journaling very therapeutic and it's just something I do compulsively. And it's not so much, it's not about talking about me, I did this or I did that. It's a therapeutic tool, and I don't know whether you find writing therapeutic.
I do. I absolutely do, yeah.
Because you're getting stuff out on the page, aren't you? I mean, I used to be a songwriter, and I always remember if I managed to do a lyric that was something I kind of wanted to say to the world, it would always give me such a buzz, especially if I actually managed to write a good song around it.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
I'm in awe of musicians. I've seen you playing the guitar and how good you are.
Oh yeah, I played something live last time you were on. Didn't
I'm absolutely in awe of musicians. I found a photograph this morning. I put it on my Facebook and my Twitter, and it's Alex Lifeson from Rush. I was a great fan of when I was young, and actually it looks so like me. And of course I put it on Facebook, and it's amazing the number of people who actually say, I didn't realise you played the guitar. Wow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And you shake your head and think, God, of course it's not me.
Well, here's a weird one. We were talking about Pink Floyd earlier. Tony Green, who's going to be my next guest, who's doing the 1967 epic with me, he posted, the famous photo of Syd Barrett when he came to the studio. And they were doing Wish You Were Here, and obviously he had a shaved head and he was very plump and everything.
Was this for Shine On You Crazy Diamond? Is that what it was?
Yeah, but Tony today posted a photo on Facebook. There's actually a photo of Syd Barrett and Roger Waters in the same, I think it's from that day, actually in the same photo. I'd never seen that before.
No,
Yeah.
it's amazing to think that actually happened and they didn't recognise them.
I know, that's bizarre, isn't it? But yeah, Pink Floyd, they're one of my top bands, obviously.
I actually wrote a book about a football player up here on Dark Side of the Moon. I don't know why, it looped for weeks and months on end. And, it's such a great... I'm sure if you're a Pink Floyd fan, actually, you might like other stuff other than Dark Side of the Moon, but the great stuff is great. I go and work in Edinburgh one day a week, and the Edinburgh Festival was on recently, and I came down the mound and a couple of young guys, and of course Wish You Were Here is always on the busker set list, but it was so good. And it's such a great song.
I did used to busk it, I'll be honest. Obviously Beatles songs are just made for that as well, aren't they?
If I could play the guitar, I would swap the whole damn thing. If I could be a rock star for a day, I would probably die a happy man.
Well, I don't play gigs anymore, but I do compulsively play the acoustic guitar. It's just, if I'm watching a film or if I'm watching, I don't know, some video or whatever I'm doing, I'm always just noodling on the guitar because it just feels, it's a bit like writing stuff down here with a notepad, it just feels right, it just feels nice. There's a thing in life coaching, because I do life coaching, it's feeling centered, that expression?
Yeah.
You feel calm and you feel centered and things feel right, it's one of those, I think.
Well, whatever gets you through the night, really.
Whatever. There you go. See, this man's a professional. He got the Beatles reference in at the end there. All right, listen, thanks a lot. We didn't manage to do 4.5 hours, but we did 2 hours 40. That's not bad.
It was fabulous. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and it's great to talk to you.
You're welcome.
And hear you in such ruddy good health.
Oh, thank you, yes. Alan Partridge. Ruddy good, yes. All right, thanks again. Good luck, and I'll promote it to the hill.
Me too. I'll do the same at this end, no problem.
All right, all the best. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
So there you have it, folks. That was episode 94 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. Hope you enjoyed that. You heard Ken make a joke about popes earlier, and I was reminded of a joke on a TV show. Can't remember which one it was, but it was a kind of show that has a pithy look at the news. And it was the time of the Polish Pope we had, who died, I think, in 2005, and who bizarrely was actually shot a few months after John Lennon. There was John in December 80, Reagan in March 81, and then the Pope in May. Anyway, the joke in the 70s was that the Pope was going to go on tour with 2 of the ex-Beatles, and they were going to be billed as John Paul, George and Ringo. He was Pope John Paul II. Not a great joke, really, but I'd rather think about that than assassinations. Just quickly, I can confirm that the next episodes will be, finally, our 3-part 1967 Odyssey. To see out the year, Tony Green and I recorded about 6 hours, and it's a pretty epic journey. I'm just going to leave you here with one last Beatlemania clip and something we talked about when the Beatles arrived back at Heathrow Airport, which was then known as London Airport, from Sweden on October the 31st, 1963, which happens to have been my mother's 16th birthday. She wasn't there at the airport that day. She was tucked up safely in the suburbs. See episode 23, the other 1960s, when she was on, way back in 2019, shortly after Ken's first appearance. We talked about something that came up in the 67 shows as well. He says, not trying to spoil stuff already, just about how the swinging 60s didn't happen to everyone. But yeah, go back to that episode with my mum. It was a good one. Anyway, thanks for listening as ever. And as I said earlier, please help the show in whichever way you can, even if it's just, as I said, telling people about the show and sharing links. It all helps. So all the best. See you in October and take care. Goodbye.
Take this, brother. May it serve you well.
What confusion here at London Airport. Hundreds and hundreds of young Beatle fans shouting, yelling, waving umbrellas and hats, shouting for their heroes, the four young men in dark clothes who just disembarked from the huge white and blue twin-jet airliner which has flown them from Stockholm. There's quite a crash at the bottom of the steps at the rear of the plane. Scores of people down there with the flashbulbs going as the Beatles try to force their way through. Massive security precautions here to bring them to the main building. Now the Beatles are making their way towards the main terminal. They're waving and smiling at the crowds. They're wearing shorty black overcoats. The Beatle haircuts stand out for all to see amidst the milling throng down there. The fans are virtually going wild here on the balcony. They're shouting and yelling, and they're having a wonderful time despite the pouring rain.